What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Johnny Mac here. Just wanted to give you a heads up that if you are looking for a community that is open to discussion as far as mentorship, conservation, the wild, becoming a better person, and all of that, there is a group for you on Facebook, and it is called Soul Seekers. Soul Seekers, we are all about making ourselves a better person. We're all about making sure hunting lasts for generations to come and encouraging people to get plugged in. Whether you are someone who has something to give or someone who needs to soak it up like a sponge, this is a community for you, and I strongly encourage you that if you're on Facebook to join Soul Seekers, and if you're not on Facebook, hop on there just for that group. It is only going to be as powerful as we all make it. And so just remember that life happens for you, it doesn't happen to you, and that you can't outgive good. You can't outgive good, people. I want you to understand that, and I want you to believe it, because when we believe that and we lead with courage and we lead with intention, lives are changed. Lives are transformed, just like on this podcast, transformation through primal adventure. Be blessed. Enjoy this episode. Talk soon. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Soulful Hunter Podcast. I'm your host, Johnny Mac. Through this podcast, I'm on a mission to transform lives through primal adventure and to spread my mission of mentorship as conservation. This podcast is powered by Washington Backcountry, a resource for all hunters both new and old. To find out more about Washington Backcountry, go to wabackcountry.com or search for Washington Backcountry on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. The Soulful Hunter Podcast is also proudly presented by the Crazy Elk Company. Based out of the state of Washington with products made in America, they are providing solutions with gear to problems you didn't even know you had. Their tag wallet is one of those solutions, and I had the pleasure of using it on all of my hunts this last year, and it is now a mainstay in my kill kit. The tag wallet is a water-resistant zippered pouch that comes with its own reusable zip ties to safely and securely store your notch tag for quick and easy access. For more information, go to crazyelkcompany.com and use the code SOULFUL with a capital S to save 20% at checkout. Be blessed, everyone, and as always, stay soulful. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Soulful Hunter Podcast. Today, I am talking all about trapping and trapping bobcats. It's something that has been on my mind and something that I've wanted to accomplish for a long time. And so when it came time to posting something on social media, there's a few different people that responded, and one of those people was Brad McBeain, and someone who I wanted to get on the podcast and talk all about his experience of what it's like to move from Minnesota out to the state of Washington, and how trapping is just a wild ball game and a learning curve. So we're going to talk all about trapping bobcats and maybe a little bit more tonight. Brad, thank you so much for coming on the Soulful Hunter Podcast and sharing your experiences with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Brad, give a little background about yourself and your experience trapping and where you're from and what you do, if you don't mind.
All right. I grew up in Minnesota and kind of had the traditional path into the outdoors, started fishing at a young age. And then when I was 11, went through the hunter's education safety program and started out that first year deer hunting and pheasant hunting. Whenever we had the opportunity to hunt anything, small game related, we were out there trying to get it done. And then as we got a little bit older, got our driver's licenses, we got into trapping in Minnesota. And at that time, and I would imagine it is still the same, it was a lot of trapping with conibears and long springs and double springs and footholds, more of your traditional, more economical traps. I joined the Army out of high school and was stationed out in Washington for about 5 years and got out into the outdoors in Washington State just a little bit at that time. And at that time, it just seemed like a difficult thing to get into as a 18-year-old kid with not much money and extremely different styles of hunting and trapping and different laws and equipment requirements. I kind of dismissed it. And then it was 2013, I relocated back out here. And after I was spent the first 2 or 3 years kind of establishing myself out here, I had the opportunity to get into archery elk hunting with a few friends. And my experiences elk hunting and deer hunting out here brought to my attention how much of an issue predatory animals were to the population of a lot of the game that I saw out here, deer, elk, and grouse specifically at the time. So I started digging into what it would take to trap out here. And at first it just seemed like a daunting task, with the requirement for live traps and having to take an online test and then an in-person test. And, it seemed more than was necessary, I guess, depending on how you look at it. But I just started piecing it out and getting it done and accumulating the equipment and started getting out in the field, and a lot of trial and error and trying to get involved with individuals out here that had some experience either trapping themselves or with the area. And I've just tried to build on my skill set, the last 3 years that I've been trapping.
Yeah. Trapping is such an interesting, I guess, lifestyle. It seems like it is the ultimate mountain man way of life and living, is to be able to actually trap animals is like so much more a step above hunting, even though you're not necessarily there in person. Like in hunting, you get that experience of like, you see the animal, you shoot the animal. In trapping, everything is so passive. You're like, okay, you got to do your research. You got to, learn where these animals are moving and traveling at. And then it's really like a wing and a prayer, it seems like. I got into I've always wanted to, since getting into hunting, wanted to shoot a bobcat. And I realized specifically bobcat calling, at least for me, I don't have the time nor it seems like the energy to specifically pursue bobcats. And so I was like, when I learned I could trap them, I was like, okay, here we go. Let's do this. And so last year I got my first live trap. I found a couple spots on public land. I had bobcats on camera walking in front, but I could not get one to commit into this live trap. And that's the whole idea of live trapping, is so much more different than the spring traps and conibears and all that stuff. So in your beginner experience, which I really love that you have this perspective, is you said before we started recording, you're like, well, trapping in Minnesota is way different rather than coming out here and using live traps. What has been the learning curve and the progression that you have learned over the last 3 years of trapping here in the state of Washington, specifically for bobcats, that could help someone new who's getting into this shorten their learning curve?
Well, I would say to shorten your learning curve, definitely the most beneficial thing that I did was when I was seeking out individuals that were trappers. I came across the Washington State Trappers Association, and they have their group that you can join, and the membership it's affordable. In my opinion, they issue a quarterly magazine that they send out as part of the membership, and they hold at least 2 events a year where they go over how to set certain traps and skinning and tanning hides and everything trapping related, not necessarily specific to one animal. And then they also have a Facebook page that was the most convenient way to interact with all of those people, because the Facebook group is made up of members of the association and then anybody else that would like to join. So It's as simple as when I first started, I would take a picture of a trap that I would set, and I would post a picture to the group and just ask, for a critique, say, what do you like about my set? What would you do different? What things can you see? And it seemed like when you were presenting them with, your progress or your effort, they were more than willing to help you out and critique you and give you advice on what to change or how to change it to be more successful. Um, Other than that, the thing that shortened my learning curve the most was getting proficient using Onyx and Google Earth Pro, and not so much with trapping as other outdoor activities, but with trapping there were still some KMZ and KML files that you could use with Google Earth Pro that were beneficial. It cut down your scouting, and kind of, if you were in the woods on foot looking at an area that looked like a potential area to put a trap, using Google Earth Pro with those KMZ files and OnX, you could expand your view and you could identify different terrain features, or just look at the topography and see what would lead that to be a good spot. And then it would kind of help you figure out where the animals were moving, or what their intent was in that area that you were going to trap. And then on top of that, to further that, I started setting out trail cameras before I got into trapping as just a winter and spring activity. I'd just sprinkle trail cameras out in my hunting areas, and it was, you go check them once a month, and it was fun to see what was on there. Well, then I started using that as a way to also scout for, different type of fur bearers that would be in the area. And if, I would identify an area that I thought certain species would be traveling or feeding, I could verify that by putting out trail cameras and seeing, where they were.
Yeah, it's great advice. Um, the I like double dipping using scouting. That's why I'm a huge proponent of bear hunting, is because when you get out in August, you start seeing a lot of other wildlife. You can use that. It's a cross training is a lost art. Being a PE teacher and a former athlete, you always heard about cross trainers, even shoes. Oh, you got your latest pair of cross trainers. That's not even a word that's used anymore. And in today's day and age, as everything is so specifically focused on one thing, that this idea of like, well, I'm going to go out in the winter and springtime and set up cameras just for fun to see where traveling is done. And I know that Tom Ryle, one of the great blacktail hunters here in the state of Washington, he always talks about, if you want to be successful blacktail hunting, go out in January, February, see where they're bedded down. And mark that and save that, because that'll come in huge for the following fall. So when it comes to, you identify these different areas, use Onyx, use these different mapping features, was there anything that really stood out to you as far as, okay, these are the things I want to target? I want to target a pond or a beaver pond or a specific dug fir tree, or are you looking for travel corridors, game trails? When you are going to make a set and you're like, all right, I'm going to dedicate, this is where I want to put a trap at, what are some of the key identifying areas and markers that you're looking for?
So in my experience, I'm limited to public land only. So where you would normally go and look for terrain features that were more conducive to, the animals being in that area, where I kind of redirected my scouting to was trying to find areas that were difficult for other people to reach. So that the issues I ran into my first year, I would go and find an area where I could park and you could hike in, and it wasn't that difficult. And before I knew it, my traps were disappearing, my trail cameras were disappearing. So I feel personally I've kind of limited my potential for success by targeting areas that fewer people are going to be in. But I would definitely, I would still recommend that path for anybody getting into trapping, because one of the issues with trapping in this state is it's not the cheapest thing to get into. Where if you're in a Midwestern state or a Southern state where you can use a spring trap, I mean, you can typically get those for under $10 a piece. Where you get into the cage traps, and you're looking at about $100 a piece and up. I mean, $100 is a pretty cheesy one. And if I've made the mistake also of going down to Tractor Supply my first year and buying the regular, like the backyard raccoon traps. And there were multiple times where I would go to check it before I had trail cameras on my traps, and the trap would be completely busted open. And I had no idea what was in it, but whatever was, those traps just aren't substantial enough to contain an animal until you're out there within that 24 hours to check it. So for a beginner trapper in Washington state or any other area that requires live traps, I would try to find the areas where you can get to that other people aren't going to. And then I would, to improve your chances of success, I would start pre-baiting with, whatever your bait may be, but start pre-baiting the area you're gonna trap about a month in advance, so that if there's animals traveling through the area that you've seen tracks or picked up on your trail cameras, you'll have the ability to kind of draw them in more, or at least catch their interest when they're traveling in the area. And then you can still protect your investment with your traps that you have to spend a small fortune on. But
I know I have one trap right now, and I was looking. I don't know. I was on some trapping website, and I was like, "Oh man, I could get like a tomahawk trap for like $75." But then shipping was like $20 on it. I was like, "Oh man!" And so, I'm
yeah,
looking at my bank account, and thinking about my wife and all the different things coming up, such as Christmas and holidays. And I'm like, I don't know if I should be doing this yet, but I do know that you catch more fish with more fishing poles in the water. And when it comes to trapping,
that's true.
you're gonna catch more animals with more traps out. So, um, okay, so pre-baiting. When it comes to pre-baiting, do you have any? Are you dipping a feather in some bait, hanging it from some fishing line of a tree? What are you doing? Are you just sprinkling it on the ground? How are you applying your pre-bait, and how long does it take for animals to start picking up on that? Is it the next day, a week? What's your experience?
So as far as what I use, I've I've tried about everything you can imagine. What I have found to be the most effective, and I was um, given the information from other people involved in trapping, they said if you're targeting cats specifically, for no reason that they could explain other than just the level of excess or success that they experienced, was beaver meat or muskrat meat. So the first time I found out about this, I talked to the guy who actually owns a fur company in Eastern Washington, and he said that he had leftover meat from his carcasses that he had skinned out. So I took two of my kids with me one day, and we made the 8 hour round trip to Tri-Cities, and we filled up 4 or 5 gallon buckets with beaver meat and muskrat meat. And yeah, I was there for about 2 hours picking his brain, and it basically comes down to taking a softball size piece of beaver meat and finding an area that you're going to trap. Then you want to put the meat 4 to 6 feet up in the air on the tree, and you get some stiff wire and just wrap it on there so that if you do have a cat hit the bait, they're not just swiping it off and running off with it. It's something that they'll hit it and they'll have to come back, twice a day or every night. So my experience with doing the pre-baiting is there were times where I would put bait out and check it 2 days later and it was just demolished. And then there were other times where I would have bait that would take 2 weeks before it would hit. So I haven't found anybody, and I haven't experienced myself any consistency to an amount of time to expect. It's been completely random to me, but the key things that I've noticed when you're pre-baiting is having it up high enough off the tree or off the ground to prevent other animals like raccoons and possums and coyotes from destroying it, because they'll get to whatever and they'll put a lot of effort into getting the bait. The other issue is, or the other thing that I would do is try to find a tree that has a branch coming off in that 4 to 6 foot height. And then you could put the bait, wire it to that branch, and then you take another branch, pine tree or alder or something, and you put a branch on top of it. And then what that does, it disguises the bait from birds, because birds will make quick use of that bait, within a couple of hours. So you want to disguise it from the top from the birds. You want to have it high enough off the ground to where a cat that's hungry can get to it, but they're going to have to work for it. But yet other incidental animals won't get to it, because you can spend an entire trapping season feeding possums and raccoons without any effort. So you gotta make sure you got your bait located in the right spot.
Right, and possums aren't that cool. Raccoons, on the other hand, I mean, they are a fur bearer. They're amazing little animals, but they're not a cat. If you're going for a cat, then that's a whole nother ball game. All right, so some of the things that I've heard is when you're setting up your trap, you want to make sure that you really dig out the ground so the trap doesn't have any wobble to it. If the trap is wobbling, it's going to prevent the cats from wanting to go in, and it's going to scare them off a little bit. The other thing is that I heard was put a black tarp, or not a tarp, but like a plastic bag over the trap, so that way the fur of your cat isn't all wet and nasty from Western Washington, and you get an idea of a better looking animal after that. Have you heard or come across any of this information?
Well, the plastic bag thing, that's something I do. I haven't heard to do it to protect the hide from getting wet. What I've noticed, and last year I started putting multiple trail cameras on every trap so that I could try to capture as much of what was going on when I wasn't there, to try to learn and adjust my sets that I put out in the future. And what I found to be the most effective method to getting a cat to commit into a cage was to take the black contractor bags, and I would put the entire trap in it. And then what I would do is get some high quality duct tape that's gonna, maintain its stickiness in the cold weather. And what I would do is I would wrap around the trap just behind the door, because all the cages that I use for cats are the guillotine style doors. So what I would do is, like a ½ inch behind the channels for that door to slide vertically, I would bring that contractor bag so that the trap was completely in it. And I would pull it tight and wrap it with duct tape to prevent a loose plastic bag from catching some wind and flapping, because what I seen on those trail cameras is that those cats are very skittish, and the slightest thing that doesn't seem natural is going to keep them from, committing to that trap. So I would wrap up all the excess plastic in tape. And then, like you had mentioned, you dig out the bottom and make sure that the trap is completely flat and level. And, you want to be able to have a bobcat go in there and not have the cage rock or wobble at all. So something that I also found helped with that, I had some 10-pound weights that I had in my shrimp pots. So I took those out and I used some wire and put them on top of the trap to help weight that down once it was set in there. The other big issue, and I noticed it seems to be from my experience watching my trail cam footage, the biggest issue with those live traps and cats is getting them comfortable or willing to step on the pan inside the trap. So I know there's some traps that have short pans, some have pans that are the full length, some are like an expanded material or an expanded metal material, some are flat. And in my experience, that's been the one thing that's prevented a successful trap is the cat having an issue with that pan. And I've, reached out to everybody that I can, and I've got recommendations to try cardboard, carpet, an asphalt 3-tab shingle, putting everything on there, and then, using dirt and moss and everything to try to disguise it. But my biggest struggle up to this point has been trying to create a natural appearing floor within the trap.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. And you said you've been trapping for 3 seasons. So how long have you been targeting cats with these live traps? Was that like your goal season 1, or is this something that you've progressing into?
Well, last year was my second year, and last year was my first year specifically targeting cats. The first year I had noticed, random animals on trail cameras that I had, that I had out scouting for deer and elk. And I just thought it would be fun to put some bait in there and see what I caught. And then I had an area where I had quite a few cats on the trail camera. So I wanted to target that. And then I had a few friends of mine that they spoke pretty highly of using the beaver meat for hamburgers and other recipes. So that was my goal last year, which was my second year, was to trap cats and beavers and use the edible parts of each one on top of it. So
Yeah.
this will be my second season specifically targeting cats, though.
Okay. I love that. If you had four things for a brand new trapper to know that's going out to target cats, what would be the primary things that they need to remember when they're going out there?
So the 4 things I think to make clear up front, it would differ if they're hunting in or trapping in Eastern Washington or Western Washington, just because of, Eastern Washington is a lot more wide open, and that creates different strategy requirements, and that can be something that can get into later. But I'm on the west side, so I can go, if somebody was to be trapping in my area, 4 things I would say is to be successful. Number 1, you have to have the quality traps that are the right size. Number 2, I would say obtaining beaver or muskrat meat is a requirement. I've tried just about everything, and honestly, that's the only bait that I've even been able to catch the interest of a cat with in Western Washington.
Huh.
Which it seems bizarre to me because a lot of the areas that I trap, I don't think there's beavers for miles. I mean, it makes no sense, but it works, So, the other 2 most important things I would say is having your traps in an area where you're going to be able to access them routinely. And that's not just for the ethical reasons of trapping an animal and dispatching it in a respectful, humane way, but also the deterioration of your bait and everything plays a huge factor to your success. And, going out, reapplying scent, making sure that I mean, there's a million things out in the woods that can cause the door to shut prematurely. So being able to check that. The fourth thing, I would say to be very cognizant of your own scent. And I know, it's pretty common with any hunting or fishing or whatever. You have to be aware of your own scent having an adverse effect on your success. But I would say that that's probably the fourth thing is do everything you can to eliminate.
Yeah, how do you go about mitigating your scent when you're trapping?
So the main thing that I do is I just try to not touch the meat, like whatever I'm using as bait, without using gloves. I mean, I don't, and I try to I have a dedicated refrigerator and freezer in my shop that I put the stuff in. So I don't have beaver meat that's going to be cat bait sitting next to,
tomorrow night's
a brisket
dinner
that's marinating in the, try to keep it as natural as possible. And then if I'm driving out to the woods and I'm eating a bag of chips or something and then touching the bait with that, when I use the bait in the woods, I always make sure I've got, rubber gloves or latex gloves or something like that.
Do you like to let your traps season outside for a while before you take them and put them out in the woods?
So I did that when I lived in Minnesota. That was, you set them out, you let them rust, you dye them. But that was with the spring traps. Out here, most of the cage traps, all of the ones that I've bought are powder coated. So letting them season in that sense doesn't really matter. But what I recommend that is something that I think helps out is if you put a trap out for a cat, before you pre-bait, put the trap in the location and just use like a can of sardines or a can of tuna and try to catch a possum or a raccoon or a skunk in that trap. And then, they can sit out there for 12 to 24 hours, whatever, until you get out and check it. And having that live animal in that cage is going to get a strong natural scent of an animal that's in the area. So then once you've trapped an animal or two in that cage that's going to stay in that spot, you can start pre-baiting, or you can even, trap a raccoon or a possum while you're pre-baiting. And what that does, it just kind of creates more of a natural scent inside there.
Interesting. Do you put any attractant inside the traps, or do you only let the bait do the scent? And then are you hanging any feathers or CDs from trees or anything like that to pique the interest of these cats?
So with the scent, I use it pretty conservatively, and I'll put a few drops in the cage. And then my rule of thumb is just a few drops, no more than 18 inches in front. Because what I've seen on my trail camera footage is, when I was learning and it was trial and error, I was squirting it everywhere, thinking more is better. And I would actually get video and photos of cats rolling on the ground, like rolling in the scent that I put out. So it was just counterproductive to what I was trying to get them in the trap. And they're rolling around like a house cat 3 feet in front of it. So I really limit it to a few drops in the cage and just a few right in front of it. And then, so with the feathers, I've done everything from hang feathers, duck wings, CDs, disco balls. I mean, you name it, I've tried it. What I've noticed, and this was another tip that I was given by one of the members of the Trapping Association. You buy small stuffed animals, and if you remember what pound puppies were,
yep,
when you were a kid, and then they had the mini version. You get a couple of those mini version ones off of eBay, and then you go to the Dollar Tree or Walmart and get a bag of googly eyes, and you find the biggest ones in the bag, and you super glue them to the head of the pound puppy, and zip tie it to the top of the cage in the back so that the face of it is facing. And, you know, I've had success catching the attention of cats, you know, not just with pound puppies, but like any stuffed animal that's similar in size, and you just use the hot glue gun and put the googly eyes on it and stick it right in top. And I've had far more success with that than I have with pheasant tails or duck wings or CDs. And after talking to a few guys that trap Washington, they said that the things above it in Washington work on the east side because you have a lot of the ridge, you know, rock ridges that
Yep.
cats can identify. They'll see the flash of a CD or a feather, you know, a long ways away. So you're trying to get their interest. Where in the west side of the state, when you're hunting in the timber, you don't have that visibility from such a distance to make that effective. So you're relying more on scent and the visual inside the trap.
Interesting. Interesting. The googly eyes. Why? What's with the eyes? Just like
I don't know. It's another one of those things where somebody told me, and they're a very successful trapper, and they didn't have an explanation. They just said, "Hey, it works. Try it." So, you know, my whole approach with trapping and even, you know, hunting in general, since I've moved out to the western part of the country, somebody can give me some advice and it comes from somebody who is successful every year, and you don't understand why it works. But to be successful, I emulate their tactics. And my thought on it is I can reverse engineer it after the fact, but I need to be doing what works to begin with.
right.
And that the googly eye trick that falls in that category right now. I can't explain it, but you know, all the trail camera footage that I have, those are the traps that are more active, and they seem to hold their attention a lot more.
Hey, this is off topic slightly. Have you on Amazon Prime? There is a documentary called Trapper Jake. Have you gotten a chance to see that?
I don't believe so.
Oh,
Doesn't sound
okay.
familiar.
This old timer he passed away since the documentary has come out, but he was like trapping all the way into his 90s and just getting after it. Though I bring that up because some of the things that it goes back to my original statement at the beginning of this podcast is trapping is like so much more woodsman skills than hunting because of random stuff that people are like, oh yeah, this worked one time and I thought I'd give it a shot, and well, what do you know? All of a sudden, this is the hot trick for trapping, and it blows me away. It's kind of like talking to the local fisherman at a fishing hole and be like, no, you can try that bait all you want, but as minute you try this, you're going to be just catching them left and right. And so that is a documentary that really spurred me on to be like, okay, I want to become a better outdoorsman, a woodsman, and to, at the end of the day, whether, the world comes to an end or whatever, like there's something to be said about being able to find food and passively bring food in. And obviously, not everyone is a big fan of eating bobcats. I know my wife, she's like, what are you going to do with the meat? And I'm like, oh, we're going to eat it. We're going to try it out, all that. I feel like it's just so much, like you watch the TV show Alone, and just like, I don't know about you guys, but it just captures me. I'm like, okay, I want to do that. I don't know if I want to live alone in the woods because I really enjoy my wife and my children, but man, the skill set in being able to do that is something that I want to get really, really good at. Something I can hang my hat on at the end of the day and be like, if I need to, I know how to. And I think that's why I wanted to get this podcast episode going, is because at the end of the day, this is just a journey. We're on this journey of self-reliance, the transformation through primal adventure. And it takes conversations like you being willing to come on and share your knowledge, even if you are what you would consider an experienced trapper or a newbie or whatever. Is like, at the end of the day, we're just doing it. And life is about living rather than sitting back and watching and experiencing that. So Brad, I really appreciate it. Are there any last tips, pointers, or tricks that you'd like to drop for the listeners before we wrap this episode up?
Well, some tips as far as trapping goes. I would invest in, there's multiple companies that make them, but the cage traps with the guillotine style doors, they'll make like a 3-set that nest inside of each other. So each one is like a 1/4 of an inch smaller, so they can all stack together. And then you can throw them on a pack frame, hike them out in the woods. Cause that's a big issue with trapping out here. You know, a cage trap is very cumbersome. And when you're trying to go through the woods, if your plan is to take one and then go back to the truck and grab another, the other issue, or the other suggestion I was make is, if you're going to either trap beavers or target cats in an area where you have to access it, or it may be easier to access it by water, getting a 12 or a 14-foot aluminum boat cuts down on a few of my spots. It's nice. You know, I can throw my kids in the boat and we just pile the traps up, strap them down, and off we go.
I love it. I love it. That's awesome. Brad, thank you so much for coming on this episode of the Soulful Hunter podcast. If people want to follow along with you and your adventures, is there any way that you'd point them to?
Well, we have an Instagram page that's it's not very active, but we do make an attempt to share our outdoor adventures kind of that our family goes on. And that's just McBeain family on Instagram. Other than that, I think I would recommend people looking for the Washington State Trappers Association Facebook page, and then get on there. I know I try to be active on there, answering questions, you know, with the knowledge that I have, the experiences I have. So that's probably the first place that I would recommend people going to get information and reach out and contact. I know there's plenty of people out there that are willing to share information. And then there's even places that people are willing to share their honey holes to newcomers.
There you go. I love it. I love it. Great advice. Thank you so much, Brad, for joining me for an episode. Everybody, I hope that you gained a lot of knowledge and insight from this episode. If you have a lot of questions, obviously go to the Washington State Trappers Association website, go to the Facebook group, reach out to Brad, reach out to myself. Not that I, by any means, know exactly what I'm doing, but I will tell you that I will be knowing what I'm doing here very shortly, through trial and error. Everybody, be blessed, be of good cheer, know that life is happening for you, not to you. Freedom on, and as always, stay soulful. If you enjoyed today's podcast, I'd love it if you could go ahead and give this a rating as well as subscribe. Also, you can check us out on Instagram under the Soulful Hunter Podcast. Make sure to tag us in pictures and posts and use the hashtag Soulful Hunter. To find out more about the Soulful Hunter Podcast, go to soulfulhunter.com and be sure to follow the podcast, as we are going to be bringing you a lot of great information, insight, and changing lives through primal adventure. I look forward to connecting with you on the next episode. Stay tuned and stay soulful.